A very warm welcome to all of you. Good evening. I, Anjum Babu Khan, Ehsaas Women of Hyderabad, is delighted to welcome all of you to our first event in Hyderabad named Kitaab, an initiative of Prabha Kaitan Foundation. The late Dr. Prabha Kaitan was a trailblazer in her own right. Born at a time when women were confined to the domestic arena, Dr. Kaitan was a revolutionary, much ahead of her time. She was a philanthropist, an author, a poet, an entrepreneur, and a campaigner for women's causes. A relentless champion for women's welfare and childcare issues, also a promoter of educational and cultural institutions and Indian art and heritage. Dr. Kaitan has given shape to the Prabha Kaitan Foundation, an organization dedicated to social and cultural welfare from the 1980s. Her vision to work for a better tomorrow drives the machinery of the organization and is embodied in her famous words, "Kanam hi jeevan hai." Almost 4 decades later, the foundation has gone from strength to strength and has launched several initiatives to further the causes of Dr. Kaitan that she had envisioned. We at the foundation promote Indian art, culture, literature, music, and highlight pertinent social causes through our endeavors. Prabha Kaitan Foundation's anthem portrays the true spirit of Indian philosophy, which is unity in diversity. Here, the poetic genius of Rabindranath Tagore flows into the folk music of Rajasthan. Dadra fuses with Kajri. True to the spirit of the foundation, we promote local artisans when it's time to show our appreciation and endorse their products. We also encourage all to buy local products to help craftsmen in their sustainability and development. At Prabha Kaitan Foundation's other events, local food is served to soak in the smell and flavor of the place. To create awareness in the community, we uphold a pressing social issue every month, and we use artist Sudipta Kundu's poignant paintings to reach out to our audience and patrons on social media and through our invitations, trying to create mindfulness among them. This endeavor is appropriately named Cause of the Month, and this December, we are endorsing human rights. You may have seen the artwork of Sudipta Kundu's depicting the same in our invite for this program. Follow us on our social platforms to know more about this. Among Prabha Kaitan's several initiatives, promoting literature is pivotal. We are always more than eager to celebrate the birth of a book, and we rightfully have named this celebration Kitaab. Kitaab provides a platform to authors to display and showcase their newest literary works before a discerning audience like yourselves and media through tastefully curated book launches. And today, in the city of Nawabs, we are gathered here to celebrate the launch of a literary aristocrat, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, his newest creation, Pride, Prejudice, and Panditry. Today's session is presented by Sri Cement Limited and in association with Alif. Dr. Tharoor needs no introduction, the ultimate man of words. Shashi is an author, a politician, a former international civil servant, a parliamentarian, and it's always a pleasure to have him with us. Today, joining him is Ms. Nidhi Razdan. Nidhi is an Indian journalist, a television personality, and an author. Now I request Dr. Tharoor and Ms. Nidhi Razdan to come on to the stage. Let's welcome them with a warm round of applause. May I request Ashita Navalgaria, Managing Director of Match Paper India Limited, to come on to the stage to felicitate our guests. Request our media to just not block the view if possible. Thank you, Ashita. Thank you to do the honors. Now, I would like to request Ms. Anandita Chatterjee, Executive Trustee of Prabha Ketan Foundation, to join us on stage to inaugurate the book. Now, we are all keen to know about the book, and as always, get mesmerized by the wonders of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's worldly as well as wordly wisdom. Also, I would like to remind everyone that this event is adherent to COVID protocols, so kindly keep on your mask and maintain necessary social distance. Kindly, please put your phones on mute so that there are no disturbances. Request you all to do that right now. And if you happen to click pictures, please don't forget to tag Prabha Ketan Foundation on our various social media platforms. So without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, now it's the time to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's conversation. Dr. Tharoor and Mrs. Razdan, the stage is all yours.
Evening at the launch of Pride, Prejudice and Panditry, and it's been a great pleasure to go through this book over the last 10 days or so when I got hold of it, because it actually is a terrific compilation of Shashi Tharoor's writings over the years, fiction, non-fiction, some new anecdotes, chapters as well, your columns, etc. And I think it was a great idea to put this together into a one volume like this. I liked one particular quote of yours, which I want to start with, where you said, "At the end of the day, I tell myself I'm not defined by the positions I've held, that my real legacy will come from the life I've led and the ideas and values I've stood for. I'm already a former minister, one day I'll be a former MP, but I hope never to be a former writer."
That's right.
That's how much writing means to you.
It does indeed. It does indeed. You know, in many ways, I've had the privilege of being able to do some very interesting work at the UN and now in Indian politics. And I think I've tried to make as much of a contribution as I could to make a difference through the work I'm doing. But at the end of the day, these things come and go. Every position one has occupied has since been occupied by others, and the positions ultimately reflect a particular role at a particular time. The books, on the other hand, and the words and the writing and the ideas they contain are meant to be lasting. In other words, way after they're written, I was just in fact saying to Nidhi before we came on stage, how gratifying it is to me that a generation of young readers who weren't born when I wrote the great Indian novel are coming up to me today and asking for me to sign a latest reprint of it. And for me, that ultimately is the biggest vindication I can have. If the things I've thought at one time, I was writing it in my early 30s, still matter as I've crossed into being a senior citizen, that I feel I've done something worth leaving behind.
I'm holding book number 23, and it's incredible how much you write. I mean, you have these 23 books, your columns and your commentary, fiction, non-fiction. What is the most difficult, you think, to actually write?
Well, George Bernard Shaw said it so much better than I can. He said, I write for the same reason a cow gives milk. It's inside me, it's got to come out, and I'd probably be in real distress if it didn't come out. So that's part of self-expression, if you want. That's vital to me. But I began as a children's story writer when I was a kid, graduated to sort of writing adult fiction in magazines. One of my, I think 4 of my first 5 books were all fiction. So that seemed to me to be my natural vocation. And yet I find that of my my last 20 years of writing have all been non-fiction. And I think the reason that has happened has to do with my work. Because with fiction, you need not just time but a space inside your head to create an alternative universe, to populate it with characters, episodes, incidents, people, dialogue that should be as real to you as what you're encountering in your daily life. And that really isn't possible in the kind of life that I'm leading. In fact, already in my last decade at the UN, and then in my first now 13 years in politics, I can tell you that that the difficulty is that the work is of such importance that it always takes priority. You can be in the middle of a creative burst as you're writing, but if the phone rings and it's something important or someone important relating to your work, it just takes the priority. It just comes in and interrupts. And I was saying to some students the other day, it's like you're building this glass palace, this palace of illusion when you're writing fiction, this world that exists only in your imagination. Because it's only in your imagination, that's why it's like glass. And every time it's rudely interrupted, a sort of crack appears in the glass. And if it's interrupted too often, the glass shatters and you've lost that illusionary palace that you were dwelling in. In the first decade of the 21st century, my laptops were littered with half-begun manuscripts of novels. I finally realized this isn't going to work. The great merit of writing non-fiction is that non-fiction is interruptible. You know, you're writing something, you're developing a train of thought or an argument, you're interrupted, you've suddenly got to go off and campaign in some election, or you've got to go off and attend a session of the Looks, or whatever it may be that keeps you away from it for a while. You come back to it hours or days or even weeks later, and it's very easy with non-fiction to pick up the train, the thread of what you were thinking and continue with your argument. So I find, Nidhi, that non-fiction is much easier in my circumstances today to write. But I definitely want to get back to fiction. Fiction is something which has always mattered to me. And you know, like there was a beer commercial, I think, in the 90s that talked about the beer that reaches parts that other beers don't reach. So my argument, fiction reaches parts that other kinds of words don't reach, you know, that non-fiction doesn't reach. It reaches people somewhere else, in the heart more than the mind. And I want to try and get back to that too.
So what was the criteria for choosing what went into this particular book? Because there's a whole host of subjects you've covered, from history to contemporary political issues. There are extracts from various books over the years. Also, your personal life, your roots, growing up, a lot of that. So what made you sort of decide that this is what needed to go in here?
Believe me, it was hard. It's a collaborative effort really between the publisher and editor, David Davida, and me as the writer, because David wanted something that cut across all the genres, but he also, as a publisher, knows that beyond a certain length, the book becomes priced out of range. As it is, this is a rather pricey book, I'm sorry to say, but from a publisher's point of view, this was the minimum at which he felt he could price this to be able even to break even. Now, it's partly a labor of love. It's the 10th anniversary of the publishing house Aleph, 40th anniversary of my appearance in book form for the first time in 1981 with a book called Reasons of State. So in many ways, he wanted it almost as a sort of monument, if you like, to my writing. But at the same time, it had to be realistic. We could have put in a book twice this length, and it wouldn't have, it still wouldn't have covered perhaps everything I would have liked to have shared with you. So there's a lot of stuff that's not there. But the hope is to sort of whet the appetites of readers. If there are people who don't know my work, and in fact, I was joking at an event earlier today that there are many people who only know me by my last tweet, forget about 40 years of published points of view and ideas. So when they dip into this book, they will see bits and pieces of various things that we hope might prompt them or provoke them to going back to the full book from which these things emerge. So there's a bit of history, a bit of politics, a bit of fiction, as he pointed out, a bit of poetry. There's even a section of some of my writings on cricket, which were not compiled in book form before. So there are some things here which you can't really pick up in a bookshop elsewhere.
What amongst the sort of personal experiences you've described means the most to you in this book?
Well, probably the two sections on my parents would probably mean the most to me, and particularly the one on my father. Thank God I still have my mother with me, but my father left us tragically young at 63, and that is now 28 years ago. So for me, what he meant to me, which keeps, of course, recurring when I talk about things like his fondness for words, which was something that he infected me with, and the kind of my mentorship and guidance, the liberalism with which he raised me. In his generation, it was relatively unusual. All of that, I thought, was worth sharing, though not very, most of the pieces, even the excerpts from the novels, are fairly short. There's nothing very long in the book. The idea is to give you something that you can dip into, in and out of. I don't expect anyone to read the book cover to cover, not even Nidhi, but I think she could dip into it, and that's what we hope the average reader will do as well.
We have your father to thank, don't we, for your interest in writing that you developed. You started very young, and he's largely responsible for it.
Yeah, I was an asthmatic child, and because of that, I was confined to bed a lot at a very young age, unable to breathe and therefore unable to sleep as well. So you're sitting propped up in bed, and what you do? All you could do really was read. And since I was the oldest child in the family, I quickly ran out of things to read. I read what I had. I read whichever of my parents' books I could understand, or even what I couldn't understand, I kind of dipped into it. So I became an eclectic and rather precocious reader. But at the end of it, when I really ran out of things to read, the only thing I could do, because there was no television in those days, there were no, obviously, mobile phones and computers and Nintendo and so on, all gleams in an inventor's eye, or not even. So all I could do, if you're not well enough to go down and play with your friends, and you're not able to breathe comfortably or sleep, and you have to sit awake, what do? I read, and when I couldn't read, I wrote. I also played something called book cricket, where you kept opening pages of a book and inventing imaginary scores for teams. Somebody has done that, it seems. But I must say that for me, the writing came that way. It came because when you didn't have enough to read, you invented your own stories, and I started writing very derivatively. I was a big fan of Enid Blyton's stories, so she had her 5 fine doubters and her famous 5 and her secret 7. So I invented the 6 solvers who went off to an Indian village and solved mysteries in a Blyton-esque manner. I used to like the sort of flying stories of the World War I and later World War II ace Biggles. And so I invented an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot called Bellows, and he was doing these things. So all of these things, to be honest, came in an imitative way, but they kept me distracted. And my father somehow saw enough promise in my scribbles to get a secretary to type them up so I could have a manuscript, a typescript to show people and so on. And he also encouraged me to keep writing, and then when I was about 10, he sent off one of my stories to a Bombay newspaper. The Free Press Journal had a Sunday edition called the Bharat Jyoti that published short stories. And they accepted it. And so my first story appeared when I was 10 years old in print. And believe me, it's addictive to see your name in print. I think that it's sort of like the first piece of chocolate or whatever. You want to keep having it again and again and again. So I kept writing. And throughout my school days, I kept writing in various magazines. I think I said, not entirely inaccurately, that I'd probably, by the time I was 18, I had appeared in every single English language magazine in India in existence in those days. So that was the kind of amateur journalism I did. Come home from school, finish your homework, and then scribble some articles or stories or whatever. How do we get distracted? Oh yeah, Dad's encouragement. So Dad always encouraged that, and he was somebody who loved words, who loved reading. He worked in the newspapers, but not on the editorial side. He was the advertisement manager of the Statesman in Calcutta and earlier in Bombay. And I found that thanks to his encouragement, I was encouraged to grow and flourish. And I kept meeting the people who were reading me, because the magazines that I was published in were the magazines that every middle-class Indian household took and read. And so there I was getting feedback in real time from my parents, friends, or my own. And all of that led to sort of my apprenticeship, as it were, in the real world of writing.
So I didn't read the whole book because it is huge, but I did dip in and out of different sections, and I sort of marked some of the sections I particularly enjoyed. I'm going to begin with a bit on humor in Indian politics, where you've talked about humor seemingly lost in India. Everyone's getting offended. You recall some of your remarks, like the infamous cattle class remark. Do you feel that that's in fact more true than ever today? Because not just you, but anyone who sort of says something that they think is humorous or funny just backfires very quickly,
Yeah,
especially on social media.
I think, exactly. I think social media also has this magnifying effect of taking something and making it much more than it was ever intended to be, and that becomes a problem too. And then the fact is we are a multilingual polity, and a joke might just work in one language and sound awful when translated into a dozen others, as happened with cattle class, for example, which is an old expression going around for about 35 years to refer to, or 40 years, to refer to the way in which the airlines herd us into economy class like cattle. But somehow it became maliciously interpreted as me sneering at economy class passengers, which obviously I'm not dumb enough to do. And the result thereafter was that even sort of Congress leaders were calling for my resignation from the government and so on.
It was a front-page story.
Beg your pardon?
It was a front-page
Front-page story for 3
imagine?
days, and I missed all of that because I was on a plane to Africa, and I was in Liberia when the dung hit the fan, as it were, of cattle class. But you know, one of the things it taught me, and that was early enough in my career that I was able to learn the lesson, is the wisdom of Shakespeare's adage that the success of a jest lies not in the tongue of the teller, but in the ear of the hearer. You know, it doesn't really matter what you think you're saying or what you intend to say. All that matters is what the listener believes they heard or is made to believe they heard. And that ultimately in politics is a profound lesson that we all have to learn, because otherwise you spend, I'm afraid I still lose votes because of that one silly expression. And yeah, absolutely. One of my staff in Trivandrum overheard a conversation on a commuter train when a passenger, a young lady apparently, was expressing happiness that now she had this train stopping at her station and coming in town so that she could get into town for 5 rupees and in 1 hour rather than 40 rupees on a bus in 2 hours coming from the countryside. So somebody else said, yeah, it's a wonderful thing our MP was able to get this done for us and organize these stops and so on. Isn't he great? Aren't you going to vote for him? And she said, oh, but how can I? He thinks we're cattle. And, you know, my staff member sat there cowering into a corner feeling terrible. And the truth is that obviously this is then, I do have a few communist rivals in my constituency who would try and encourage this kind of thinking in order to get the votes that might otherwise come to me. But it's an example of how you can't afford, no politician can afford, thank you, can afford to be misunderstood like that.
So
and therefore you really find that most politicians in India eschew humor in the public arena. They will try and be funny in private, and many of them have a good sense of humor and they laugh and so on. But the moment they're in public, they're very conscious that they can't cause offense, they can't be misunderstood, they shouldn't say anything that could be twisted.
So
and the handful of politicians who do.
Yeah, no, but then is that the remark that you regret making in hindsight? Is there anything?
Oh yeah, because you know, the thing was just a very trivial thing.
Yeah.
A journalist whom I didn't know at the time, but later turned out to be a very well-known pro-BJP writer, Kanchan Gupta, is the one who asked the question when the government announced an austerity drive. He sent me a tweet saying, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class? Now, since he was using the expression, and it was one which I had been very familiar with for my preceding 3 decades in the West, I said, yes, I will travel in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows. Typical St. Stephen's kind of joke, you know, I mean, that's all it was. And needless to say, I didn't give it a second thought and I went off, and this is all this happened when the dung hit the fan, as they say. And so I've stopped that kind of repartee now.
So you do find yourself perhaps censoring yourself sometimes on social media? You don't say whatever you want to say?
No, I tend to be a little more careful than I would be if I wasn't in politics. Because, you know, ultimately, and even some of the things where I may still have made sort of, if you like, smaller mistakes, it's simply because, you know, we are all as human beings convinced of our own intentions, of our own virtue, of our own sincerity. But it doesn't always occur to us to ask ourselves, we know we are this way, but how will the person listening to this or seeing us or whatever, how will he or she interpret it? Politicians have to do that all the time. Rest of us don't need to.
The other interesting chapter that I enjoyed reading was about your run for UN Secretary General's post. When you look back on that, and if you could just tell us a little bit about that, there are some interesting anecdotes, for instance, China saying it would not stand in your way, etc. But when you look back on that, did you ever regret running?
No, I didn't, because, first of all, the idea didn't come from me. It came from Prime Minister Manmohan Singh himself. Every year, when the Prime Minister comes to the UN General Assembly, he meets the senior national of his own country, and I was the senior Indian at the UN at the time, and therefore he would meet me. And I also knew him because years earlier, when I was quite a young UN official in Geneva, he was there with a body called the South Commission. So we had met at dinners and meetings and so on and so forth. So it's not that he was a stranger to me. And he and I got along and we understood, and I think he enjoyed having somebody with no connection to Indian politics to talk to when he came to New York. But in 2005, which was his second visit after becoming Prime Minister, he asked me point blank, would you be interested in being nominated? And I said, of course, Prime Minister, if India wants to do this, remember that the first thing we'll need to make sure is that the Chinese will not veto, because if they're going to indicate their opposition, then this is really not worth it for either you or for me. And he said, all right, and then they went and had their discussions. Neither of us thought the Americans would be a big problem. India was in the process of discussing the Indo-US nuclear deal at the time with the Americans. But the Chinese were the people who worried us a bit. So that would have been September of 2005. In early 2006, about January, I got a call from the National Security Advisor, Mr. Narayanan, in the Prime Minister's office, saying, we'd like you on your own bat to explore with the Chinese. I said, shouldn't India be doing this? He said, no, we feel that if India does it, it may actually elicit the wrong answer. You are, after all, somebody they know as an international civil servant. Why don't you find out? I said, no problem. So I called the Chinese ambassador to the UN, the permanent representative, Ambassador Wang, and I said, I'd like to come and call on your foreign minister. He said, sure, anytime. I said, let me explain why. I said, this is it. There is a possibility of my country being willing to nominate me for Secretary General, and I wanted to ask whether he would be willing to receive me to discuss that. And if the message comes from him that he would rather not have a meeting on that subject, we'll get the message loud and clear and there'll be no embarrassment to anybody. So he said, I understand what you're saying, let me check with Beijing and come back to you. It took a very few days, but within a working week, I got a call back saying, my foreign minister says, we'll be most happy to welcome you in Beijing. So I said, you did explain it's on this subject. He said, yes. I said, I want to make it clear, I'm not coming on behalf of the United Nations. I'll get my own ticket and come as a personal individual. He said, in that case, we'll send a car to the airport to receive you. And they did, and they took me off, and I had a very good evening. In fact, the young Chinese Foreign Service officer in the car escorting me, I said, he expected it to be about a 20-minute meeting. That was what had been blocked on the foreign minister's schedule. In the end, it was an hour and a half long, and we had a very detailed conversation. And at one point, he switched into French, and I responded in French, and we chatted in French for a while, and then he ended by saying, now all you need to do is learn Chinese.
He didn't talk to you in Hindi, because they can do that too.
So some of the Chinese are capable of all that too, but that one, French and English were his. And he pulled out a napkin and wrote my name in Chinese characters. I think I still have that napkin somewhere, but I'm not sure where. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, the key message that came out of the meeting was exactly in his words, and he took care to speak in English, because at the beginning it had begun in Chinese through an interpreter, as the Chinese always do. But then, as I said, it switched to French and finally ended up in English. And he said, China will not stand in your way. So I conveyed that back to Delhi, and they were pleasantly pleased to get the news. Perhaps surprised, but certainly they were pleased. And as far as I was concerned, I thought that removed the most significant likely obstacle. But in the end, it turned out that, in fact, we got it wrong. The Koreans had already lined up strong support from the US, which had a lot to do with their bilateral relationship. And India was much more focused on the Indo-US nuclear deal. And this was very much, obviously, secondary. So I don't think that we had made much of an issue, much of a big deal with this with the Americans. And at the end of the day, the Americans not only went for the Koreans, but they voted against the other candidates, including me. So though I ended up with just 2 votes shy of Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the first ballot, the 4th ballot had different colored ballot paper for the permanent members of the Security Council. And it turned out we had 1 permanent member voting against me, and that was the Americans. So once it was clear that there was a permanent member opposed, there wasn't any point in continuing the race, and I pulled out. But looking back, no regrets, because while I was doing it, I mean, the messages I was getting from so many countries, so many ambassadors, so many others, you're perfect, your entire working life is a preparation for this job, we want you there, that kind of thing. In the end, it didn't happen because the system was one in which the 5 permanent members have a veto, and that's fine. I mean, that's the way it was. And Mr. Ban, in many ways, represented the kind of person they wanted in that job. So no complaints, no regrets. And I think that looking back on it, it was still worth trying. In fact, I sort of derived a lot of consolation from the Bhagavad Gita's message that you do the right thing regardless of the outcome. Do what you're supposed to do your duty, do what you think is necessary to do, and don't worry about the outcome. And in the end, in fact, the outcome didn't work so well, so that's okay.
You've written about the case for a presidential system. So tell us about that, because you've actually written extensively on why you believe parliamentary democracy is not working in India and that we need to have a presidential system in place.
Did I put that into this book?
That's right.
I'd forgotten. Okay. I'd forgotten which pieces made it and which ones didn't, but there, I'm glad that one is there because...
When did you write this? Or did you
I've been reiterating it in different versions over the years. I think I first wrote something along these lines in the mid-90s.
So what is the
Then
reaction?
I mentioned it in a page or 2 of India from Midnight to the Millennium, which was 1997. And then I wrote a much longer piece in Tehelka magazine, which Tharoor Tejpal was running at the time, sometime in the first decade of the century. And then finally, I did a longer version still in my book, India Shastra, from which this is excerpted.
So what was the reaction to it the first time you sort of put this out there? Or was that a more tolerant time of different ideas?
Tolerant time in the sense that people understood this was an idea that I was floating and not... There were a couple of discussions. There was one in the Constitution Club in Delhi. And there were a couple of MPs there from other parties as well. Rajiv Pratap Rudy, I remember, thought it was a good idea. Manish Tiwari seemed to think it was a good idea, but with caveats. And then 1 or 2 others said this is completely wrong and unworkable and will create a dictatorship and all of that. So the whole... But the problem when you talk about a presidential system is that people only focus on the president at the top. And they think, oh my God, Mr. Modi is already so powerful, you make him president, we'll never see the end of him, etc. The truth is, it's not that. What I'm talking about is a system of directly elected chief executives at all levels. So that the village panchayat chief is directly elected. The town mayor should be directly elected. The chief minister or governor of a state should be directly elected. And the reason for that is twofold. One is that in each of these cases, you would have somebody whom the voters have directly chosen and not indirectly picked by the party they belong to, that their individual merit is not tied to the number of parliamentarians that their party is able to elect, and that the quality of the person is buttressed by both a security of tenure, because when you elect an individual, it's for a particular term of office and not dependent upon the whims of a legislative majority. And at the same time, that person should be given the budget and the authority to actually keep their election promises. And then you would be able, as a voter, to be able to judge that person by their ability to fulfill their promises, because they no longer have the excuse of the fact that they had to take some coalition partner along or all of that stuff. They really have the burden by themselves. And the conceptual basis for my thinking this way is in the essential idea that you need a separation of powers amongst the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. In classic theory, The French writer, French political philosopher Montesquieu wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, in which he made this very good argument, and I've been convinced ever since I read that, because to my mind, the argument for separating powers is that then you have three ways of ensuring that the liberties and rights of the people are protected. Right now, you elect a legislature not to legislate but to form the government. And once the government is formed, the legislature becomes a captive of the executive, and indeed becomes a rubber stamp for whatever the executive wants to decide. Today, once Mr. Modi has won his 303 seats in the Lok Sabha and become Prime Minister, he can do literally what he wants legislatively, and the BJP's pliant majority will oblige him every time. And so if he wants to pass a law saying that the moon is made of green cheese, they will vote for that, because there's also an anti-defection law, that if they vote against that, defying a whip, they can be expelled from Parliament. Now, that kind of situation makes a mockery of the separation of powers. And that's why I'm saying we really should have an independent judiciary, an independent parliament or legislature to hold the executive accountable, and an independent directly elected executive at the center, in the states, and even down below at the districts and village levels. And each will serve as a check and balance on the other. If the worry is that you'll have a dictator, no way, because in a country our size, somebody sitting in Delhi is not going to be able to overrule an executive chief minister / governor in a state, and so on.
So coming to sort of contemporary politics, my favorite, does the F word apply in India? And here you talked about Moditva, Hindutva, and why you believe, and you've explained that before and you repeat that here, why the word fascism does not apply to the Modi regime. Now, this is a word that is quite liberally used by the liberal left for, I mean, these are sort of the terms that are bandied about. Explain that to us, why you don't see it that way.
Well, first of all, I believe in using words to convey very precise meanings. And the word fascist has now become a term of abuse rather than a meaningful intellectual category to understand and explain any political phenomenon. So by calling the government fascist, it's intellectually lazy. It's just sort of, taking a stand that has rhetorical value, if you want, but which actually is not a comprehensible or defensible way of describing and analyzing the government. What I've done in this chapter is to actually go through in some detail the elements that are known to constitute what has been historically understood as fascism, and to say that sort of the green shoots, the basis of each of these elements is unfortunately visible in what we are seeing in what I call Moditva, which is Hindutva plus a personality cult around Mr. Modi. But I do say we are still a democracy, we still have free and fair elections, we have opposition parties, we have a free media, even if very often they've either been cajoled or cudgeled into listening to what the government wants them to report. And so we still have enough institutions and individuals who are able to challenge the government, which certainly would not have been true in a sort of classic fascist regime like Mussolini's or Hitler's or whatever. I mean, those are regimes where even saying what I'm saying now would have ended me in jail tomorrow and so on. And therefore, I would say, no, we are still a democracy. We shouldn't lazily use terms like fascist. But we should certainly ring the alarm bells that there are these signs which should not be allowed to grow unchecked.
And yet we're part of a democracy summit hosted by the US President. You have a chapter that you've devoted, in fact, to your own interactions with Narendra Modi in the past, which were interesting. You can tell us a bit about that. And why do you think that at the moment he appears to be unbeatable?
Well, I don't go into that part in this chapter. This is really just sort of reminiscence.
Well, you talked about how they sell brand Modi and so on. So
that's right. So I mean, the thing is that I first met Mr. Modi in 2007, January, at the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas in Chennai. I had been asked to keynote speak there, and I was invited to lunch by an Indian minister of the UPA government. And when I got there, to my utter astonishment, Mr. Modi was sitting right there. It was a small lunch of just 5 or 6 guests. But it turned out that he was there as Chief Minister of Gujarat, and since I had not thought I would ever seek a meeting with him, but since he appeared to recognize me, know who I was, and we started talking, I decided to ask him some of the blunt questions that people of my sensibility and point of view would normally want to ask. And I must say he was very impressive. He gave, he wasn't rattled, he wasn't hostile, he wasn't defensive. He answered freely. I said, you know, what happened in 2002 being unforgivable. He said he did everything he could. He called the army out, and it just took a few days for the army to get there and solve it, etc. Then I asked him about the ghettoization of Muslims in Ahmedabad. He said they prefer to live that way. Then I asked about specific things to do with his policies as Chief Minister, and I said there is a perception that Muslims in Gujarat are not getting a fair deal under your Chief Ministership. And he said, let me tell you a story. And he said, you know, some commission came to see me. I'm surmising it must have been the Sachar Commission. A commission came to see me from Delhi, a whole bunch of people sitting in my office, and they said, we hear you doing nothing for Muslims in Gujarat. So I said to them, and he tells stories very well. He said, I said to them, take out your notebooks, write this down. I have done nothing for Muslims in Gujarat. So he said they all took out their pens and they wrote this down. I've done nothing for Muslims in Gujarat. Then he said, but also write this. I have done nothing for Hindus in Gujarat. I have only worked for Gujaratis. Now you can imagine, this is pretty impressive stuff, right? And I'm an audience of one. I mean, literally, I'm sure there were, but I think two other guests there at the time and the host. That was the kind of conversation. So I left saying, this is not a man to underestimate. He knows how to explain himself. He knows how to reach out to people. I was somebody of really no consequence. At that point, I was a UN official visiting from far away and known, if at all, for writing and for just having lost the Secretary General's race. He didn't need to either impress me or even take much trouble. He could have dismissed my query. But he took the trouble because for him, making such a point seemed to be part of the message he was seeking to convey, and indeed it drove home. I had other interactions with him which are somewhat less positive. I've talked about one of them, slightly carefully worded because the publishers, for legal reasons, censored some of the words he actually used, which I won't get into, because you know there's appropriate and not appropriate. But he said certain things that revealed a slightly different cast of mind. And then subsequently, I met him a few times. For example, in his first couple of years as Prime Minister, Pranab Mukherjee was still president, and I was frequently invited to the Rashtrapati Bhavan banquets for visiting heads of state and government and so on. And so those were opportunities to have informal interactions with the Prime Minister. And some of those were actually quite interesting. There were some things I can't talk about at all because, to my surprise, he would ask my views on certain political things that he might or might not do. And then there were also some purely sort of personal conversations, one of which I think I've mentioned, when I asked him, because, you know, Mr. Kejriwal had just been tweeting movie reviews that week, and I said, I don't know if you've seen this, Mr. Kejriwal sees a movie a week and tweets about it. Do you see movies? And he said, no, I don't have any time for doing that. I said, how can you say you have no time for movies? After all, if you are representing the people of India and leading them, don't you want to know what's in their minds, what is important to your own voters? And he said, for a second, I never thought of it that way. And that was an exchange that I found quite, there's sort of a human side to this kind of exchange, which has not been possible since, because once there was a change of president, my name disappeared off the invitation list anyway. So I haven't been back and I haven't seen Mr. Modi informally. But I just wanted to say that that part of the thing that has been lost in recent years is indeed this ability to talk across the political divide.
I was going to ask you that, do you not meet in Parliament?
Not at all. I mean, first of all, he rarely comes to Parliament. I've complained about that in my writings and speeches. At one point I said, and it was true, I have to recalculate it now, but at one point I said he has spoken less in the Lok Sabha, of which he's an elected member, than in the foreign parliaments he's visited in the course of his extensive travels. If you just add up the number of speeches he's made in the Lok Sabha and the number of speeches he's made abroad, so he's not a frequent presence in Parliament. But also, frankly, we've now got a disappointing gulf in the relationship between the government and the opposition. And I remember, Mr. Manmohan Singh telling me again before I came into politics how he would reach out to Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Advani For example, during the Indo-US nuclear deal, invite them for breakfast and so on to try and persuade them that this is something the BJP ought to support because it was a continuation of policies the BJP had initiated in their own talks. And I must say that I have not seen any evidence of the present government making any serious effort to do anything comparable with the present opposition. And to my mind, it's a pity because ultimately democracy requires opposition, but democracy requires some cooperation between government and opposition where common ground is possible, and therefore a willingness to explore that common ground. Here it's really my way or the highway. There is no exploration of common ground. And we've seen this now with the expulsion of 12 opposition MPs in the Rajya Sabha, which really seems to me to be a somewhat high-handed way of silencing a certain set of voices, most unfortunate.
Is there a bigger concern, though, that you have, that not just the suspension of the MPs, but that's a more worrying sign of institutional decline? I mean, when we talk about watching our democracy backsliding, we are seeing question marks on various institutions, certainly the media, of which I'm a part, the judiciary, and parliament too, where bills are being passed within minutes without any discussion or debate.
That's right.
So is that of a concern to you, that parliament today, is it losing its relevance?
Yeah, so in fact, I've done a column on that very subject just in the week, I think either last week or the week before, so too late for this book. But this is exactly the theme that I wrote about, that our institutions, that ultimately democracy is about institutions and not individuals. And individuals will come and go, none of us is immortal. But the institutions should be strengthened by us having occupied them. Now, if we have failed to do that, if we've actually undermined the institutions in bending them to the individual will of a person, we are actually undermining the pillars on which democracy itself rests. And everything you've mentioned, Nidhi, I can add to that. I mean, you mentioned rightly, I think, the judiciary, questions have been asked, the media, which in many ways is not playing the role that we would like a free media to play in a responsible democracy. The independent institutions like Parliament, which are really no longer independent in any meaningful sense of the term. I've actually stood up in Parliament and said, you've reduced Parliament to a notice board and a rubber stamp. And I remember the then Law Minister, Ravi Shankar Prasad, getting up and saying that I'd insulted Parliament. But the truth is, a notice board is where you announce, this is what I'm going to do. And no one has any say in the matter. That's the way in which the government treats Parliament. And a rubber stamp in the sense that their majority will always agree to everything they put forward. And that's not good enough. You know, it's got to be a deliberative body. And then in addition to that, I mean, where is the independence of the Reserve Bank? It's no longer what it was supposed to be and what it had been in earlier decades. What about the Election Commission? There have been some real questions asked about how much the Election Commission appears to be obliging of the government of the day. And then there's also, frankly, been a few examples in other institutions, ranging from, of course, the CBI, ED, Vigilance Commission, all of those, right down to even things like the Information Commissioners, where the government has now passed a law that gives the government the right to control the tenure and the salaries of the Information Commissioners. What an amazingly brazen way of ensuring that there will be no awkward RTI inquiries admitted. So in these and then the other techniques of deliberately keeping vacancies in a number of autonomous bodies. So the more vacancies there are, the more the backlog piles up. You know, when so many information commissioners around the country are not appointed, the result is that people send their requests for information, they never get fulfilled. So you've got some real problems with the way in which our autonomous institutions, which we were all proud of seeing strengthened, are now in many ways being stripped down.
Well, we have time for, I think, 2 or 3 questions very quickly. So if you have a question for Shashi Tharoor, please raise your hand. And yes, ma'am, can we get a mic there? Ma'am, would you like to stand up so that we can just get the mic to you?
Gentlemen, I agree with you, Mr. Tharoor.
Hello. Yes.
But at the same time, we are a little disappointed that the opposition party, which was in power, is the one which led us to vote for this party. Correct?
I suppose that must be true of you. Okay. I didn't vote for this party, well, you did, so you've explained why. All right.
No, but what do you do? What do you do?
So we are trying to construct a case, ma'am, for the voters, and we need to be able to get it across to all of you, namely that this government has really let the nation down in fundamental ways. Our economic growth has been really hurting since demonetization onwards, and it has really cratered in the last few years, including during the first year and a half of COVID. Our unemployment rate is the highest ever recorded in the history of recording unemployment figures in India. And at the same time, we are seeing major setbacks on the border, setbacks in terms of our social harmony with communal violence and incidents of mob lynching and cow vigilantism and God knows what else on the rise. All of this happening has undermined what India was all about for all of us and in the eyes of the world. And so we are explaining to people that this government has truly let down the people of India. Equally, we are offering or advancing an alternative vision of an India that's humane, that's inclusive, that celebrates its diversity and pluralism rather than trying to shoehorn India into a Hindutva monolith, of an India that actually is home for everyone, and India at the same time that believes in social justice and taking care of the marginalized in our country. So that kind of India is the India we want to protect and we want to build, and that's the message we're trying to give people. Now, obviously, there is a problem because so far that message hasn't won us 2 elections. But the message is compounded by the fact, I think, that we have, in the last 2 elections, Mr. Modi winning only 31 and then 37% of the vote, but that the majority of first 69 and then 63 being split in multiple ways amongst myriad opposition parties. So if we can do a little more than we have done so far to promote and achieve opposition unity, then in addition to us having a good, strong message, as I described to you, we would also have, I think, some electoral arithmetic in our favor.
That opposition unity is going very well, isn't it?
Dr. Tharoor, I have a question on the title of your book.
Yes, sir.
Pride, Prejudice and Punditry. While I understand the first 2, Pride and Prejudice, I get it. But the third one looks as if it is just to form a cute alliteration, or is there a deeper reason in this?
Yes and no. You know that I've been writing columns in a number of publications in India and around the world for a number of years. And the sort of casual description of a columnist is as a pundit, not the authentic pandit who's a learned, wise person, but a pundit is somebody who just gives gyan, as it were, to his readers. And so writing of columns and opinions is called punditry. So in fact, I'm very curious that you've chosen to question that word. Others who have questioned the title have actually questioned the prejudice part, because they're wondering where my prejudice comes from and what's revealed. The truth is that the punditry is just about there are some pieces here which were just columns in newspapers, magazines, or on internet sites, and which therefore reflect the other element in the book.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Dr. Tharoor, do you think the present Congress leader is a cause for what is happening in the opposition? Do you think Madam Gandhi has served her time and she should step down?
I think that, this is the equivalent to what's called a bomb-throwing question. I'm going to duck that explosion. But there were other hands on this side too, Nidhi. You've been very partial to the right, like most of the media today. How about taking some from the left also?
Okay. Couple of more quick questions.
We'll take a couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
Dr. Tharoor,
But when the down hit the fan and you were traveling to Africa, what class were you traveling?
What's mine?
What class were you traveling when the cattle class died?
Oh, we were on an austerity drive. So though ministers are normally entitled to travel first class, and BJP ministers do it all the time, I was in business, which was one notch down. Not in cattle class, you're right.
Okay, one absolute last question.
Dr. Tharoor,
Okay,
good evening
someone has
again,
taken the
and
mic.
it is pleasure to see you here.
Thank you.
I'm
sir.
here, sir.
Okay, thank you.
And this is actually a time to celebrate what Mr. Tharoor has been expressing through his extensive writing, and knowing him in person, I still wonder how Mr. Tharoor is able to write so many books, so many columns. I'm Sridhar, sir. so many books, so many columns, and so much of expression about the society. And having known you in person, I still wonder how you managed to spend your whole lot of time. And also, we'd like to know what's your next work that is coming up.
Right, thank you, Sri. This is Sridhar Bevara, who has written some very remarkable books. An amazing sort of rags to riches story in his own right, which many of you should know, and I've tweeted about him when I met him earlier this year. My next book, though I say this with a lot of diffidence, because I don't know when the time is going to come to be able to write it, I'm still plowing through the research and I'm about 6 months behind deadline, is intended to be a short biography of Dr. Ambedkar. The idea was to do something for the 75th anniversary of India's independence. And I thought, who better than the individual who chaired the drafting committee of our constitution and gave sort of legal and institutional shape to the freedom that had just been won 75 years ago. So I had some ideas and thoughts. I'm still researching the life because obviously people are interested in people's lives more than in their ideas, and I want to make the ideas an integral part of the life story. So let me do some more research, and then perhaps I can write in a white heat and get this done. But it's going to be a challenge finding the time with all that's going on in the country these days. But thank you, Sridhar. That's the next book.
Thank you, everyone, for your enthusiasm and fervor. And on behalf of Prabha Khaitan Foundation, I thank Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Ms. Nidhi Razdan for a wonderful evening full of wit, humor, and meaningful conversation. I would also like to show my gratitude towards our presenter, Sri Cement Limited, and Associate Aleph Book Company. Last but not the least, I'd like to thank the audience for being a part of this endeavor, and without your support, this evening would not have been successful. With this note, we'd like to conclude today's program. I'd like to let everyone know that books are available at a 40% discount, and Dr. Tharoor would be happy to sign that for you right after a very short press conference of 10 minutes, if we could limit it to that. And we'll conclude. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you, everyone.